The fourth of Beethoven's string quartets, published along with five others in 1801 as the composer's Opus 18, is the only minor key work of that set. The chosen tonic is C, and you might find it useful to compare this C minor work with other compositions in that key by the same composer, including his third piano trio, published about half a decade earlier than these quartets, and his third piano concerto and fifth symphony, which came later. This quartet is unusual in that all four movements are set to the same tonic, C minor in the case of movements 1, 3, and 4, and C major for movement 2. Such homotonality is far more likely to be encountered in minor key works than in compositions set in major keys. As in minor key works generally, the most important secondary keys are the relative and parallel major, and the submediant A-flat major also plays an important role. The C minor quartet is overall a serious-sounding composition owing to both the key choice, the character of the primary themes, and the work's inexorable logic, which unfolds with a kind of relentless determination even during the Featherlight Scherzo. It seems to me that in this latter regard, only the A-flat major trio of the C minor minuet movement affords a bit of breathing space. An overview of the work would probably be in order before we dig in. The first movement is a sonata form movement with a repeated exposition, and its two themes are so obviously related that some commentators consider it monothematic. Movement 2 is a C major scherzo, although the scherzo designation has to do with its style, not its form. The third movement is a C minor minuet with an A-flat major trio, and the final movement, also in C minor, is an ingenious hybrid of rondo, sonata, and variation form. There's much to admire and enjoy in this quartet, and I hope it brings you the kind of joy that I experience every time I listen to it. The recording is by the Emerson Quartet. A tone of dead seriousness is struck immediately by the opening movement's first theme, whose inaugural paragraph is a grim-sounding tune played by the first violin over a tonic pedal in the cello, broken into driving eighth notes, with the second violin and viola paired in a homophonic accompaniment. Here you can see all that. Notice how the first violin begins on its lowest available note and starts a steady ornamented climb. When we go to the next system for the continuation, we see the second violin and viola joining the cello in its motor rhythm, while the first violin soars into the stratosphere, reaching a peak almost 3 octaves above its starting point and driving forcefully into the first big cadence on the downbeat of measure 13. Here, the theme's second paragraph begins with great C minor hammer strokes, followed by a thematic continuation in the first violin that finally raises its line to a full 3 octaves above its inception, and the falling away is into a protracted half cadence, followed by a brief chasm of silence. This thematic non-closure is, in fact, typical of the entire movement, with the themes mostly denied closure, which generates the sense that one must keep going and going until the sought-for resolution is finally attained. This quality, along with emphatic block chords, hard-edged syncopated patterns, and off-center accents, yields a sense of inevitability often remarked on and celebrated in the music of this composer. The transition is a short one, moving directly into the relative major key for a second theme that is obviously a paraphrase of the first. You see it in the second violin, and it will soon make its way into the first violin part for a restatement an octave higher, not an unusual strategy for this composer. This theme 1 paraphrase isn't the whole story. The second group includes a second member, and here you see the off-center accents I alluded to a little earlier. Incidentally, published music often contains errors, and one should be no more surprised by them than one is by the occasional typographical error that finds its way even into a carefully edited book. I rarely call attention to these, but I know several of my viewers have spotted some of them. There's an example here with an additional unauthorized sforzando marking finding its way into the fifth measure of this system. One does come to read past these slip-ups just as one corrects for typos. It is this theme, what I've called 2B, that finally closes definitively, and just look at the way that closing is set up, with that death-defying 3-octave plunge in the first violin that makes even the hapless Marie's final Hilfe sound reserved by comparison. The exposition closes on tiptoe, and the beginning of the development is a rude harmonic shock. Let me show you how Beethoven sets that up. The first time through, this mostly unison closing passage falls quite easily and naturally into C minor from the note right before the first ending. The first ending's loud, reiterated dominant seventh chord resolves naturally into the return of the first theme in C minor, seen here. But the second time through, Beethoven changes the direction of that unison line so that in the second ending it curls upward, not downward, and then continues chromatically to a dominant seventh of G minor. It's the linkage that's shocking. Despite such a jarring beginning, the development itself is one of Beethoven's most tuneful, with both themes given very full treatments in G minor and F major respectively. Let me say a few words about the peculiar notation of the latter. You see the beginning of that treatment in the final 2 measures of this system where the cello goes into treble clef. Look how high that part seems to lie. That line appears on paper to soar into the high singing register of the first violin, but its sound is actually an octave lower than notated. This is an archaic use of the treble clef as an alternative tenor clef. I confess to finding it jarring every time I see it, and also somewhat inexplicable, as Beethoven does use the standard tenor clef for high cello writing elsewhere, employing both usages within the same work and even the same movement, as in the first of the Emerson quartets, for example. During the recapitulation, the first theme is reworked so as to yield a return of the second group in the parallel major. This is very much an 18th century approach to sonata form composition, and as I pointed out earlier, the Opus 18 set is very much music of the century of Haydn and Mozart, with the great Beethovenian breakthroughs yet to come. Nevertheless, we are vouchsafed tantalizing hints as to the character of that future Beethoven, and they may be especially heard during this movement's brief coda, which provides a powerful, harmonically challenging peroration to bring this unyielding C minor essay to an emphatic and uncompromising close. The mood shifts along with the mode at the onset of movement 2, set in the quartet's parallel major key. This movement is identified by the composer as a scherzo, but that designation applies to its style, not its form. The movement is actually worked out in sonata form with a repeated exposition, and the key relations are those we expect of major key compositions. The movement's first theme is a four-voice fugue exposition, with the subject announced by the second violin. The music's light, tripping character is evident from the notation, and this posture is maintained almost throughout the movement. As in the corresponding theme in Movement 1, this theme is denied closure, ending on a forceful half cadence in the primary key. The multifaceted second theme, whose bold opening paragraph is introductory in flavor, is set in G major, as we would expect. Some of the most feather-light music of the movement appears here. The exposition is completed by a substantial closing section, which ends with quiet emphasis in the secondary key, and the entire first section is repeated. The development is occupied almost entirely with the main theme, whose constituent motives are examined from a number of different perspectives, including a mysterioso quality A minor passage in quietly brushed eighth note strokes. The retransitional paragraph that grows directly out of this is remarkably subtle, eerily beautiful, and strikes me as predictive of a musical future not at all like its 18th century past. The movement's greatest treat arrives at the recapitulation when the four-voice fugue, which during the exposition was based on a single subject, comes back with three, one of them being a Vivaldi-esque play on Baroque dotted rhythms. The recap is almost entirely regular, which is to say that all the music heard during the exposition returns intact, albeit reconciled as to tonality. The two-part coda revisits that gently brushed mysterioso passage from the development, but with new harmonic garb. And its final paragraph, inaugurated by a complete statement of the fugue subject by the first violin above a gentle waltz-like accompaniment from the rest of the ensemble, also includes a closing passage that went missing from the recap. This thoughtful musical accountancy is characteristic of classicism. It is true of important transitional composers generally that their earlier works exhibit great fidelity to the models furnished by their predecessors, and the journey into the new and dangerous only begins later. The third movement actually takes the form of a scherzo, but since the scherzo role has already been taken by movement 2, we will instead hear a minuet. The mode shifts back to C minor, and the dark, unsettled mood returns. Look at the opening of this movement, the way the first violin begins the theme on its lowest available note, leaps a fourth to the tonic, and then commences its climb over an active cello line and with the two middle voices filling out the harmony. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Here's how the first movement opened. I think the parallels must be obvious. Now back to the present movement. Notice its tempo marking, allegretto, and keep this in mind. I'll return to it later. Let's take a look at my analytical notes. I've identified this movement as a C minor minuet in 2 repeated strains. You see the entire first strain before you, a rhyming 8-bar period. What this means is that the strain's 2 constituent 4-measure phrases are similar in their rhythmic profile and melodic shape. The first of those phrases ends inconclusively in every thinkable way, while the second ends firmly on a tonic chord on the downbeat. The strain is then repeated, and the key of C minor is thus firmly established. Moving on, you can see from my notes that the minuet's second strain is more active harmonically than the first. It's also quite a bit longer, hence my division of it into 2 paragraphs. The first of those paragraphs is developmental in quality, with a beginning that sounds like a modal shift to C major. This is only a temporary brightening, however, and actually signals a move into darker territory, that of F minor. The second subparagraph moves even farther afield, into D flat major. Since the context of any music is created both by what comes before it and what comes after, we can look at this remote key from 2 different directions. In terms of what came before, this represents a shift to the submediate of F minor, an important key relation in this quartet to be explored further when the time comes for the contrasting trio. But D flat major is also the Neapolitan key of C minor, which is the primary key of this movement. This means that a dominant prolongation is not long in coming, for the Neapolitan chord is a predominant chord functioning in a way that is similar to the behavior of augmented sixth chords. You can see that outcome here with the viola and cello both headed to their low G and the cello sustaining it for retransitional purposes. The second paragraph of the second strain is the internal reprise and closing. If this movement were more sonata-like, this return would correspond to a recapitulation, and the music thus remains in C minor throughout its closing subparagraph, which ends emphatically. This longer strain is then repeated. This C minor gloom is dispelled for a while by the A flat major trio, which, as you'll notice, does not get a new tempo marking. The minuet's allegretto is presumably still in force. The move into A flat major from C minor is of course analogous to that from F minor to D flat major, which we experienced in the minuet's second strain. This is thus a case of a macrocosmic expression of a microcosmic event. What exactly is this trio about? Primarily, the second violin and its 2 deeper voice companions are sharing a melodic idea in overlapped call and response. Notice that beginning in measure 3, the cello echoes the second violin line faithfully, while the viola inverts it. The harmony is provided both by the sustained lower voices and the counter-melodic line provided by the first violin, a quiet rustling of arpeggios plied up and down as gentle waves broken into murmuring triplets. It's a lovely effect, as different in style and aesthetic impact from the hard-edged minuet as might be imagined. This sub-movement is more sonata-like than the minuet, and the reason for that lies in its first strain, which, unlike that of the minuet, modulates to a secondary key. I have thus indicated that its first paragraph is analogous to a first theme in sonata form, its second to the modulating transition, and its third a second theme in the secondary key. And since the strain is repeated, one experiences something like a repeated exposition in sonata terms. Notice in this connection that the second strain follows a developmental course to the return of the tonic, and the return of the second theme in the primary key is eminently sonata-like. This strain comes to a close in A-flat major on the arrival chord about the middle of this system, followed by a brief silence. This is where we would expect to see a repeat sign, indicating a second trip through the second strain. But instead of this, Beethoven reiterates his cadence figure an octave lower, turning it this time to the relative minor, which provides the hinge back into the home key, achieved by the subtle chromatic modulation you see indicated in my notes. Then comes the return of the minuet as called for by the menuetto da capo indication. But look at the note Beethoven appended at the end, prescribing a faster tempo for the minuet the second time through. It's time to talk about a performance problem. I've twice called your attention to tempo, which is indicated only once at the beginning of the movement. In the recording you're about to hear, there's a radical tempo difference between the minuet and the trio. The Emerson Quartet's chosen tempo for the minuet does not land on my ear like an allegretto at all, but rather like a hell-bent full-on allegro, a tempo that would be impossible to sustain during the trio, hence a radical tempo shift there, although Beethoven does not call for one. I've reviewed quite a few recordings of this quartet to see how other ensembles handle this problem, and most seem to line up more or less with the Emerson Quartet's approach. To me, the result is disconcerting, rather like the uneasy cohabitation of two incompatible characters with irreconcilable differences. I did, however, find one recording in which the performers seem to have solved this problem. It's by the Cooperstown Quartet, and I'll provide a link in the description below. Their tempo for the minuet is quite a bit broader than that of the Emerson Quartet, but the music doesn't suffer for it. In fact, the minuet's intensity is ramped up in a sense, with the Emerson's near panic replaced with something that sounds more determined. In other words, more like the opening of the first movement. And the real beauty of this is that the tempo of the trio does not have to change to accommodate the first violin's rustling triplets. Check them out, and you'll see what I mean. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts concerning this. As pleasant as this sojourn in A-flat major has been, the overall ABA form of such movements does guarantee a return to C minor, and there the movement ends, darkly and emphatically, much like movement 1. Sorry for all the time-consuming theory lessons, but as I've indicated before, I want these videos to be as useful as possible to as many viewers as possible. The finale is a deft blend of rondo, sonata, and variation forms. To clarify, this is not a specimen of that often encountered hybrid known as sonata-rondo. In those cases, it's the sonata imperatives that are the main driver, with the rondo touches added for purposes of deeper integration. In this case, however, it is rondo imperatives that drive the whole, with the sonata touches understood only in retrospect. That is why I've identified the opening theme not as theme 1, but as theme A, with the overall pattern of this movement being A, B, A, C, A, B, A, an arch-like rondo with theme A serving as the recurring refrain, always in the same key. That theme, a vigorous C minor fiddle tune with a pronounced Roma flavor laid out in 2 strains of equal length, is also varied on each of its returns, so variation form is invoked here as well. Some of the time, the repeats in this theme are literal and indicated with the standard repeat signs. In other cases, however, the repeats are written out to accommodate further modifications. These instances are known as double variations. I want to examine the first strain a little more closely in the interest of drawing a distinction. As you can see, I've indicated that the opening phrase comes to a half cadence in C minor. If you'll look at the first 4 measures, you'll see that despite the seeming exception of the B naturals, there are no chromatic notes here. B natural is not actually a chromatic note in C minor. It is rather the leading tone of the key, which is why the version of the minor scale that contains it is known as the harmonic minor scale. But if you look at the second phrase, you can see that I've indicated a modulation, and in the run-up to the cadence, you can see a whole gaggle of chromatic notes, beginning with the first violin's E natural and including F sharp, C sharp, and A natural in other voices. None of these are C minor notes. They belong to G minor and its most common secondary dominant. This is not a distinction without a difference. The experience of hearing it should make that clear. When we go on to the second strain, we see a bit of development in the first phrase, which ends on a held half cadence, and then a return with a powerful definitive C minor ending with the lowest string of all 4 instruments fully engaged. In future returns of this theme, the fermata in measure 4 is sometimes present and sometimes omitted. When I speak of contrasting episodes, that is the language that is appropriate to descriptions of music in rondo form, but in the present case, the first of those episodes, a lyrical A-flat major theme also set in 2 repeated strains, will be brought back later in C major, and thus functions also as a second theme in sonata terms. Unlike theme A, the strains of theme B are not of equal length. The second strain is twice as long as the first, which allows for a modicum of development. I believe it's worth noting that the move from C minor to A-flat major is something that we encountered earlier in the C minor minuet movement with its contrasting A-flat major trio. This consistency is one more means of tying this wonderful composition together so that it's experienced as one thing, not 4. The next thing we hear is the first return of theme A, this time with its repeats written out for further varying, much of it of vigoroso character. And then, in place of a development section, we get another theme, this one in C major and also constructed in 2 repeated strains. The upbeat to its main phrase supplies the motive with which the movement ends, a motive that seems to point directly to the opening gesture of Mozart's last and greatest symphony, the C major Jupiter, written well over a decade before this quartet. As you can see, that motive also plays an important role in this theme's repeated second strain. The second return of the further varied main theme is succeeded this time by a dominant prolonging bridge passage whose purpose is to open the way to the return in C major of this movement's lyrical theme, theme B, which we heard earlier in A-flat major. This is the sonata touch I mentioned earlier, the bringing back of the second theme in the primary key of the movement. On this return, we will hear only the first repeated strain of this theme, and on its repeat, the fiddling character of the movement's main theme is added as an accompaniment in the second violin, while the first violin and viola sing the theme in parallel octaves. There are really no words to describe to you how wonderful I find this passage to be. This partial return of theme B yields organically to a generously proportioned bridge passage that returns the music to C minor, finishing with a powerful dominant prolongation in that key. Notice the last two measures played by the first violin alone. A flat and F sharp don't seem to cohabit very comfortably, do they? The interval between them is a diminished third, which sounds in isolation like a whole step because, as you've heard me say before, the ear cannot see. But in this C minor context, something important is afoot. If you invert a diminished third, that is, move its lower note up an octave or its upper one down by a corresponding degree, the result is an augmented sixth, and that fact reveals the function of these two notes. You may recall that I've stressed the importance of augmented sixth chords in setting up the arrival of big structural units. This one announces the coda, which begins with a final return of theme A as refrain, this time with its constituent strains played only once at a prestissimo clip. This coda is in three parts, during the second of which the music rushes headlong towards C minor ruin. But right at the moment of catastrophe, the wind is sucked out of the music's sails and the mode shifts to the parallel major for the coda's final part, the part I often refer to as coda ultima. As you can see from the E naturals in the second violin and viola parts, we are now in C major, although the second violin's A flats, serving as borrowed subdominants, retain some of the darkness of the minor mode, like scar tissue on a healing wound. The movement ends with fortissimo bravura, with all four instruments in unison, sending us off with emphatic, shouted reiterations of the central theme's Jupiter motive. Great fun all around.